how we prioritize diverse voices in historic preservation. Before I introduce our wonderful panelists who we'll be hearing from shortly, we'd like to hear from you all. What brought you here today? What are you hoping to learn? I'm going to be adding a link in the chat, and I invite you all to respond to this question. I see, there we go, here's our chat. I'd like for you to respond to this question by clicking on this link, and you will be able to respond to this question and we'll be able to see your results live. So what brought you here today? What are you hoping to learn? And for those who might be having trouble with this link, feel free to also add your ideas in the chat. But for those who are able to, click on that link and let us know what brought you here today. What curiosities do you all have? Questions, comments, concerns, community engagement, building coalitions and partnerships? What is deep listening? Engaging divergent ethnic communities in preservation, how to bring people together. Some similar thoughts and ideas, and also different ideas as well. Give a few more moments for everyone to settle in, get your morning coffee if you're tuning in from the West Coast. Share your ideas with us. What are you hoping to learn today? Better skills? Give you all one more moment to gather your thoughts, invite you all to share some last moment thoughts in these last moments. How to center diverse voices, engaging communities and not traditional preservation demographics. So keep these ideas in mind, keep these questions in mind. As John had mentioned, we'll be having a formal Q&A session at the end of our presentations. But before then, feel free to share your ideas, questions, and comments in the chat. And hopefully we'll be able to come together and have a great conversation at the end. So thank you all for participating in that. So as a reminder, we are in deep listening, how we prioritize diverse voices in historic preservation. Today, we'll be hearing from preservation organizations and community advocates who collaborated to preserve historic and cultural sites in Los Angeles, Chinatown, and San Francisco's American Indian Cultural District. We have two staff members from two historic preservation organizations and two community advocates who are joining us. I'd like to introduce you to them all, and as I do so, panelists, I invite you all to turn your cameras on so we can see your lovely faces. Carrie Young is San Francisco Heritage's Communications and Programs Manager. Born and raised in San Francisco, Carrie helps to advance SF Heritage's mission by producing public programs and neighborhood-based initiatives, cultivating of community partnerships, and sharing creative content across the organization's communication channels. Sharia Sousa Taos Pueblo Ut Kiowa is the executive director and co-founder of the American Indian Cultural District. She is an ambassador for promoting equitable resource distribution to Native American communities, increasing Native visibility and political representation, and protecting and preserving tribal cultural resources in the San Francisco Bay Area. ECR Rivera is a former researcher, teacher, and longtime activist in Los Angeles. She has recently concentrated her anti-gentrification action through a preservation lens. Rosalind Zagara is the neighborhood outreach manager with the Los Angeles Conservancy, where she develops local preservation leaders throughout the Los Angeles County area. She is a co-founder of Save Our Chinatown Committee in Riverside and serves on the board of Asian and Pacific Islander Americans in Historic Preservation, API-HIP. Welcome to our lovely panelists today. We'll begin by hearing from each of our presenters and the projects that they worked on. Following that, we'll be having a moderated Q&A. Following that, we'll be having an audience Q&A, so we'll be able to engage in a discussion with you all here today. So let's begin. I will invite Sharia and Carrie to tell us more about the project that you all collaborated on. Let me go ahead and share my screen for you all. Oops. Thank you all for your patience as we're getting our slides ready this early morning. All right, we are ready to go. Here we go.
Good morning. Thank you, Sana. If you don't mind going to the next slide, please. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sharia Souza, as she mentioned, Tatat House, Pueblo, Ute, and Kiowa. And as First Nations people, and as we talk about the history of the land, I think it's really important that we take this moment, no matter where you're coming from today, and pause and honor the First Nations people. If you're anywhere in the United States, there's over 500 nations. If you're anywhere in California, there's over 150 tribes. Today, I'm coming to you from the unceded land of the Ramaytush Ohlone. The Ramaytush Ohlone have never lost, ceded, nor forgotten their rights as the first people of this land, as traditional stewards and as caretakers. The Ramaytush Ohlone, Jonathan Cordero and Greg from the Association of Ramaytush Ohlone have helped draft a land acknowledgement, which you actually read within the Human Rights Commission and throughout the city. And today I want to talk to you a little bit more about how we don't just talk about a land acknowledgement, but how we actually work collaboratively with Indigenous people through our partnership with SF Heritage to put action behind our words. Native people aren't a thing of the past. We're a living history and a culture that continues forward. You can please move to the next slide. I'm coming from you today as the executive director and co-founder of the American Indian Cultural District. What a lot of people don't understand is the American Indian Cultural District may have been founded on March 31st of 2020, but the American Indian people have a long, rich history throughout San Francisco. Unfortunately, the way that San Francisco was founded, not many people know that American Indians have had a strong history here. So the area which we call the American Indian Cultural District today is currently located in the Mission District. As you can see our map here, we're currently in the process of our third expansion. However, the history of American Indians within the Mission area, ironic as we even think about the name Mission and what that meant to American Indian people, have been here for a very long time. San Francisco is actually, I believe, the third largest relocation city in the United States, which meant from the 1950s to the 1980s, American Indian people were given one-way bus tickets to relocate for the promises of living a better life and for assimilation off the reservations. American Indians also came here during World War II for jobs and different things like that. In addition, one of the bigger draws that most people are aware of is the occupation of Alcatraz in 1969, where Native people came together to really talk about visibility and rights, which sparked giant changes in federal Indian law throughout the United States for American Indians. So today I'd like to let you know that our history is not just within the American Indian Cultural District, but throughout California and throughout the United States. The area that is now the American Indian Cultural District actually used to be known at one point as the Red Ghetto, because it was one of the places in the city where American Indians could afford to live. Today, the highest concentrations of American Indians are within our cultural district, and then the Mission itself within the Tenderloin and around Golden Gate Park. If you'll please go to the next slide. One of the biggest issues that we deal with, or one of our biggest priorities at the American Indian Cultural District, is bringing in resources and elevating the voices for American Indian people through an Indigenous lens. Today, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about our partnership with SF Heritage and how we're working together to do that. But first, I'll tell you a little bit about one of the projects that we're working on. We're working on a project called Indigenized SF, and the Indigenized SF project has a couple different components. One of those components, which I'm most excited about, is called Mapping Genocide throughout San Francisco, taking a really deep look at what our history and what our city was founded on. In our research, we looked at streets, statues, and parks to see what streets and statues were named after those who contributed to the genocide of American Indians. As you can see on my map above, I only started mapping some of our core streets around where we're currently located at Fort Mason. And there's over 37 streets that honor those as part of genocide. One of those streets that I like to give an example of is Lion Street. It's traveled by over 40 million people every single year. Colonel Lion was part of a massacre of over 500 Pomo people. Another example I like to give is Mason Street at Fort Mason, where we currently are. Mason, who gave the white men in Southern California a horse to slaughter the Indians. Yet today we still are in these places and we still talk about how we can collectively bring healing. But I think before we bring healing, it's really important to look at what our city was founded on and who are those people that we're honoring. So another aspect of our project, aside from genocide mapping, which what we're doing with that is we're hoping to reach out to the community and have them envision what do they want these streets renamed as? What statues would they like to see in the place of those who honor genocide? Another area that we're working on is our flagpole banners and murals. So if you guys go down to 16th Street in Mission, currently you'll see a very large mural in the Mission. If you want to go ahead and go to the next slide, please. You'll see a very large mural in the Mission as part of our Indigenized project to bring visibility to our cultural district. And another area that we're working on as part of our Indigenized project is our QR scan code stories. And this is what we started to work on with SF Heritage. So our QR scan code stories really tell the history of Native American organizations, businesses, significant areas of cultural happenings within the city. For example, San Francisco, being the home of the occupation or being the home of the longest walk. We're really going through and interviewing different folks and getting their perspective. And what we're hoping to do is when you take a walking tour, when you're going down the streets in the Mission, or you're going down the streets anywhere where one of these different instances took place, that you're learning from Native people through their lens what our history is like. For example, I live in District 5, which is over by Golden Gate Park. A lot of people don't know there used to be an American Indian Historical Society here. And that's one of the 6 posts that we've currently done with SF Heritage to elevate the stories of those organizations and those businesses that were here or that are here. So more specifically, the projects that we're working on with SF Heritage is our historical archiving project, which will essentially take place as part of our QR scan code walking tour when we document those sites and areas. Another thing that we're working on is American Indians are currently one of the few communities of color in the city that do not have a historical context statement. A historical context statement is used through the city and through the planning department to elevate the history of Native folks in the city. Another thing we're working on is cultural site documentation, working with planning department and working with SF Heritage to do cultural site documentation through a culturally relevant lens. Currently today, when we look at state and federal preservation laws, which is why I think this conference is so relevant, we look at those really stringent, historical preservation tools that are really rooted in colonial power. For example, when we look at Bulletin 38, which is a federal policy about preserving traditional cultural properties, one of the things that Bulletin 38 really is centered around is around integrity and continued use. Unfortunately, as American Indian people, when we look at some of our sites, like the village site that used to exist out there, Dolores Park for Ramaytush Ohlone folks, the integrity is no longer there. It hasn't been continued use because unfortunately that village site was wiped away by the mission system. However, the significance of Chichui and Yalamu, which is what San Francisco was once known as and is currently known as to our Ramaytush Ohlone people, still holds that history and still holds massacres of over 14,000 people, 14,000 American Indian lives that were taken in the mission system. So I'd like you all to think about that as we walk into the mission system every day. I love that Director Davis from the Human Rights Commission said it's like walking into the plantation, yet we don't think about that with people. So I just wanted to really talk about and honor our partnership with SF Heritage. I know when I first came in there over 40 years, I told Carrie, I was like, I looked in your guys' strategic plan And I looked at what you all did, and we're talking about the heritage and the cultural preservation of San Francisco. And it doesn't include the voices of American Indians. And I couldn't be more grateful and more honored that this is not just a way to have a land acknowledgement, but actually put action behind their words. And we've never had a better partnership with an organization where SF Heritage said, okay, what can we do better? And what can we do to help you and help your vision and help your people and really recreate that history in San Francisco and honor the voices of American Indians. So with that, I would like to go ahead and pass it on to Carrie. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sharia. And so my name is Carrie Young, and I'm from San Francisco Heritage. And so as Sharia was just mentioning, before SF Heritage's partnership with the American Indian Cultural District, there really had been no meaningful prior engagement between our organization and the Ramaytush Ohlone or the local American Indian community. And Shreya rightly pointed out these gaps when we first met. Now, San Francisco Heritage has been expanding its historic preservation work over the years to be more inclusive of cultural preservation and the preservation of living heritage. And in looking back at important work that we've done, like sustaining San Francisco's living history, as seen here, it was clear that we needed to continue to build upon what we've already done to be even more inclusive of American Indian heritage and the unique approaches required to undertake preservation work in this community. Also, as Shreya was mentioning earlier, so SF Heritage, for example, was instrumental in supporting and also informing the creation of the city's cultural district program as an important cultural preservation tool. And so it just made sense to us to engage in a focused partnership with the world's first American Indian Cultural District to assist in their priorities and in their programs. Next slide, please. As Shreya mentioned, our initial partnership with AICD has been focused on increasing visibility for American Indian cultural heritage in San Francisco. And as a very first step, in 2021, our board of directors passed a formal land acknowledgement and a commitment to working meaningfully with the American Indian community. And we're grateful to Shreya and also to Greg Castro of the Association of Ramaytush Ohlone for helping to inform this work. And just as a note, this land acknowledgement is on a redesigned version of our website that will be launching soon, in case you visit our site and it doesn't look like that. Yeah, next slide, please. So for our series of collaborative posts spotlighting important historic and cultural sites in San Francisco, AICD identified the sites and connected me with important community members who could share the history of these places, and many of whom were directly involved in their histories. And so we've highlighted these places on our websites, in our newsletters and our social media, which has been really an opportunity to amplify reach and awareness. And working on these posts, it brings to mind something I heard someone say recently at actually the Latinos and Heritage Conservation Conference in Denver a few months ago. And that is, quote, leadership and neighbors cannot help save what they know little about. And so supporting AICD's efforts to increase visibility for these living histories, it's really to it's helping to create a legacy, I would say. It helps combat the belief that American Indians do not exist anymore in the city, that there is no history after the mission era. Yeah, all these beliefs, that kind of misconceptions that Sharia mentioned. And my colleague, Wendy Labanti, always says that everything should do more than one thing. And these articles and the research done, they're not meant to be used once. This work can now, for example, provide the foundation for many other AICD preservation and documentation initiatives, as Shreya listed earlier, including a National Register multiple property document and an American Indian historic context statement for San Francisco, which is long overdue. And this work will in turn aid in the identification of other resources as well. Next slide. And finally, so in addition to this visibility across our communication channels, our ongoing partnership with AICD really means being proactive and continuing to look out for opportunities to assist the cultural district in their work. And this includes offering gathering space for the district in our 2 historic properties, for example, as seen here, bringing AICD into our educational programming, such as our annual lecture series, and also incorporating this partnership into our long-term strategic plan, which we are, for the organization, which we are currently working on right now. And so with that, I want to say thank you to Shreya, and I want to hand it over to ECR and to Rosalind.
Thank you, Shreya and Carrie. So many interesting tech resources that I'm fascinated by. I think next time I'm in that area, I definitely will try out that QR app. And I hope everyone else will as well. So moving right along to get through, we would like to invite ECR and Rosalind. And I'm going to stop sharing so you all can begin your presentation for everyone. So welcome ECR and Rosalind, and we'll move right along.
So, hi, I'm ECR, and I'll be talking about how LA Chinatown's long-term residents and stakeholders developed a community plan, a people's plan. This effort began a decade before in a protest against Walmart coming into Chinatown. You can see that in the top left picture. We subsequently found ourselves trying to put out all these mini fires related to gentrification. So we began having focused community meetings, and that's in the bottom left, where the top 2 concerns from the community were, by and large, the decimation of true affordable housing and the disintegration of the social fabric, meaning the loss of basic resources in our small community that used to exist, healthcare in the community's native languages, and a dwindling of the ethnic grocery stores. Our first petition we began as Save LA Chinatown was in opposition to new market rate buildings and an increase in older buildings. So we asked LA City Planning to set a moratorium for us, but we also knew we needed hard data to prove what the conditions were on the ground. So we created an app, and if you look in the top left, right corner, that's our community members using the app that used augmented reality so they could share their vision of Chinatown. From this app, we decided to create a community plan, and this became a coalition of an all BIPOC group, raised in Chinatown, lived there for decades, 2nd or 3rd generation members of the community that started just writing a community plan together based on our data. So who are these long-term residents of Chinatown? Chinatown as a community has one of the lowest annual median incomes, or AMI, of the entire city of Los Angeles. In the 2010s, we began to see AMI rise in the city, in our little neighborhood. And despite an uptick in attempted evictions and mutual aid distribution, long-term residents were not doing better. So we could surmise from that what was happening here was gentrification, new moneyed residents moving in, while long-term residents were still not doing well. So the long-term residents, in terms of diversity, are very diverse. We're majority Cantonese speaking, but a lot of the Asian diaspora, including Vietnamese, Cambodian, and because it's LA, Latino, live here too. More than anything, it's multi-generational households of immigrant low-income residents that work in tandem with the tourist infrastructure and the affordability of the housing in Chinatown. So for 80+ years, you could truly live the live-work dream, where you live up the street and you come down and that's where you shop and that's where you work, and you could live here without really needing a car. And we saw the decline of this historic community. For those of you who aren't familiar, LA's Chinatown has looked like this. For generations, Chinatown has been low scale, ornate, aimed at tourists and classically LA, full of mom and pop legacy businesses. The previous city plan had pretty high floor area ratio allowances, FAR, sometimes called in the planning community. The buildings were never built up though in those 80 years to kind of maintain aesthetics, separating it from downtown LA. But developers wanted to turn our small historic community into this. To us, this is the erasure of our legacy and our community. And just for reference, these buildings would go up near places like Olvera Street, oldest street in LA. So exemplifies how out of scale these plans were, not to mention that most of these are market rate office spaces and hotels. So nothing really for locals. So the city's planning doc finally came out in 2019. On the right, you can see that's their land use map, and on the left is our land use map. Our map did come out slightly before theirs, but it's because we were kind of preempting that they were going to do this. And if their map was clearly in our eyes spot zoned in the interest of developers, and we really felt they didn't even have an understanding of the neighborhood. And as if you can kind of tell, our Chinatown looks a little different than their Chinatown. Our village boundary, for example, is in yellow, and ours is much different, different shape, bigger than what the city chose to give us. And in fact, they kind of asked us for our data gathered from our app and from community meetings. To me, that was kind of them telling us they didn't do their due diligence, and now they just wanted to poach our information. And I didn't feel like it was in good faith. So regarding the village boundary, Rosalind with LA Conservancy will talk you more through what we use to create our bigger village boundary.
Thanks, CCR. Again, I'm Rosalind Sagara with the Los Angeles Conservancy. Despite the city's attempts to support and reinforce historic and cultural components through the land use that they called villages in the downtown community plan, as ECR mentioned, community members found that the city didn't fully understand what the neighborhood's historic resources were or how cumulative losses were impacting them. To amplify community input, the Conservancy worked together with stakeholders and local historians in 2019 to produce a map identifying cultural and historic assets, seen on the left. The map was used to educate the city and council district staff and to make a case for expanding the village's land use area in Chinatown, which shows where a lot of our the pins are in the yellow and pink area. Pictured on the right is one of the identified sites, the Chinatown branch of Bank of America. In 2021, the Conservancy submitted a historic cultural monument nomination for this property, which is currently pending council approval. Community members and the Conservancy continue to advocate for the expansion of the village's land use area and other policy recommendations for the fall of 2021. Our collective advocacy has led to the expansion of transfer development rights, or TDR, in Chinatown, previously only considered in the Arts District. The TDR program will incentivize preservation by transferring unused and bonus floor area from an eligible donor site to a receiver site. As the city further develops the TDR program in Chinatown, community input must be considered. Next slide. The Downtown Community Plan continues to move through the approval process, and we remain committed to strengthening protections for historic resources in the plan area. Our collaboration with Chinatown residents and stakeholders on the Downtown Community Plan is part of a broader effort to expand our focused outreach to areas underrepresented in historic preservation and to build capacity for local preservation projects. Understanding communities' concerns over the loss of existing affordable housing and the social fabric has helped us better align our engagement in support of community needs in Chinatown. In closing, I want to bring us back to the people and places that have guided our collaboration and express my deep appreciation for leaders like ECR, King, Diane, Dorothy, Munson, Jean, and many others who have contributed their time and knowledge to make the Downtown Community Plan better for Chinatown residents, but also for the broader LA community. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosalind and ECR. And moving right along, we are going to begin our panel where we'll dive into some of the issues that each of our organizations and community advocates faced. And hopefully you all can learn a few different strategies from them that they've taken to address these different issues to protect historic and cultural sites of significance. So I invite all of our presenters to show your lovely faces so we can have a great conversation. I'm gonna make sure that we can see everyone and just adding a spotlight to everyone as well. So we are ready to go. So my first question for you all is, some of you mentioned some challenges that you faced. ECR, you mentioned in terms of the zoning, that there was an inconsistency between the city's planning department and the community members who are working together. Sharia, you also mentioned a similar issue in terms of designations within the American Indian Cultural District. And so I'd love to hear from you all about different challenges or barriers that you faced in doing this work in partnership. ECR?
Sure. So for us, well, regarding zoning, we were having a hard time because everything was in their planner speak at all times, and that is a full stop for a lot of community members because they feel like they're not heard. They're checked out once they hear something like that. They're like, well, you're talking about 13-1, what do you say? So I felt like it was a cop out on the part of city planning or whoever, right? A professional coming in and telling a small community. And like I said, of sometimes they just people that tend to feel less than, in a way. And so it was a way to kind of get us to disengage. And I think what our job was as activists was to bridge that and to make them feel not disengaged. So getting community members, and like I showed in that picture, we got seniors, we got people that weren't used to technology, people that whatever the barrier was, we try to break that barrier. And that takes trust on for us. So knowing your neighbors beforehand, not to get something done, is so important.
You touched upon two things that I want to highlight for everyone. One, at the end, you talked about trust, right? That mutual trust between residents and community partners. Who are you, and what are you trying to achieve, and how can we work better together is incredibly crucial, and that takes time, right? And accessibility in terms of the conversations that you're having, the terms that you're using, the language that you're using, the type of language that you might be speaking in as well, if English might not be the first language for residents. So thank you, ECR. Carrie or Sharia, do you have any ideas to add or would like to share any challenges and barriers you both faced?
I'm happy to share some. I think for us, it's really that truth telling that happens behind that. A lot of people don't want to hear the truth, right? Because when there's truth, there's action. And you have to really realize, when we talk about Lion Street or Fort Mason or Columbus, what we've allowed for so long and what our history is founded on. When they removed the Columbus statue, it was like when Native folks removed a different Columbus statue or a different statue of Junipero Serra, it was a bunch of angry Indians doing something. But yet when another community removes it, it's activism, or it's like, why are you trying to erase history? But we don't actually talk about the painful side, both the good and the bad, right? Of those sorts of things. Or when we're trying to rename, when we talk about the mission means a lot to so many people. They're like, yeah, the mission, but to talk about the average lifespan of being 10 years and the 14,000 people, that were massacred in the mission over there, 14,000 American Indian lives, or the 80% population wipeout. We don't like to talk about those ugly parts of history. So, the good part is there is positive aspects. Like we have amazing partnership with Fort Mason. We love being out there. They've done nothing but support us. And the same thing with SF Heritage. Yeah, maybe they didn't cover our history for 40 years, but there are people willing to remedy it. But I think people have to step back, not take it personally, and really be willing to hear the truth of the different things that they do every day, or the different things that we say or think, or the streets we drive down that we take for granted, and why we're not even looking at them or looking at American Indian people as a people instead of the thing of the past.
Right. I mean, we often forget about that learning zone where we often begin with discomfort. You lean into this discomfort, you move forward from that. It's not going to be forever, but it does exist. And, you know, I appreciate you acknowledging that this work is not easy, and it does involve confrontation with our own personal biases. And so incredibly important to keep in mind. I know that's something that I'm also keeping in mind as well. And, you know, finding, you know, space for that emotion, but moving forward from that as well.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. It's just acknowledging kind of the limitations of what you and the organization have currently done, but also recognizing kind of the positive work that the organization has done, but while recognizing that there's more to do. So it's not saying like, oh, it's totally a bad thing that you know, we haven't done enough. It's just taking that moment, recognizing it, and you know, moving forward. And that's what I think that we've done at SF Heritage. And yeah, so there's a lot more work to do. And aside from that, I would say kind of organizationally, a challenge, you know, will always be capacity and also ongoing communication kind of internally. And so I really can't thank our board and our staff enough for their support of our partnership with AICD. And I would say there needs to be ongoing communication internally about the long-term nature of this work, and that we need to continue to dedicate staff time and resources to this partnership so that it's just not, you know, superseded by other projects and other areas of work. And it's a challenge for our organization that focuses on all areas of the city and all its communities. And so because we cannot be everywhere at once, you know, we just have to be proactive and intentional about choosing partnerships to dedicate time and resources to. And for me, these are, you know, our partnerships with AICD, which is really greatly expanding our preservation work, you know, not only to help tell different stories, but to just also to work with a city program that is itself like a really new and unique preservation tool, which are the cultural districts and the cultural districts program. And kind of seeing how this cultural district in particular, AICD under Shreya's leadership, is really further expanding kind of the tools in our preservation toolboxes when it comes to preserving and doing cultural preservation work. So that's what I'd say.
Thank you, Carrie. Let us know in the chat if you also struggle with capacity. I've heard this echoed in many different organizations that work within historic preservation, that we have so many great programs that we'd like to invest time in. We care. We care. We're people who care about this work. But we also recognize and acknowledge where we might not have the resources available to us, and which is why, you know, conversations like the one we're having today and understanding how we can share resources with community partners, with residents, and collaborate and, you know, leverage capacities amongst the community members, I think is incredibly important. So great work that you all are doing, and thank you all for taking out your time to be here today to tell us more about that. Rosalind, do you want to share any challenges that you may have faced or any helpful suggestions before we move forward?
No, I mean, I think that Carrie and others have touched on a lot of the you know, challenges I think that we also face in terms of capacity and being able to just keep everybody on the same page over like a long period of time. In our case with our collaboration on the downtown community plan. I mean, this is a multi-year process, that started before the community plan draft update came up. The community had already been organizing and gathering data for years prior to that. We weren't involved in that process per se, when we approached community members about their concerns over because we knew that the downtown community plan was going to be released, that's when we learned all the work that had already been done. So it made sense for us to really help to amplify that work, to really better understand what community issues were, so that we could bring our resources to bear in the process moving forward. So, I mean, a lot of the times, the decision makers don't really understand how much work community members are doing, as volunteers, as people who really care about, their community and how it's changing and what's important about their community. And we were just trying to help city better understand that.
And kind of this takes us into my next question for you all. In thinking about this work, and in addition to people, what resources or tools have been helpful, or strategies even have been helpful in doing this work? So in addition to, collaborating with individuals and residents or organizations, are there other resources and tools or strategies that you all can share with us?
I'd say just to speed up, but sorry, go ahead.
No,
I'd
go
say
ahead.
the speed up but slow down, like Carrie said, creating long-term sustainability. I have a staff of 3, and we do an entire strategic plan for the whole city, and we are located in the mission, but we serve the whole community. If there's a Giants game going on, they're like, where's our tickets? If there's a food need, they call us, and I'm like, we're a staff of 3. But I think creating that long-term plan, and then I just wanted to create one thing. It's not really necessarily what you asked, but that, no matter it is when you're from communities of color, doing these things in a timely manner, but also speed up, slow down, because our elders want to see these things happen too. That's the most important thing for our community. That history, that oral history, that knowledge is something that, and I'm sure that's in every community, is super precious. But I think creating a long-term strategic plan, even and being realistic about your capacity, is my biggest flag.
Very important. Would you mind, sharing a bit more in terms of the oral history aspect? Is there a suggestion that you have in collecting those type of histories?
Yeah, I absolutely love what we're talking about with SF Heritage and with planning. Is we've actually worked in an alternative way to talk about recording history and finding city resources to do things different. For example, historic context statements have been rooted in data and all these things that you can measurably put on a piece of paper. However, when we talk about our village sites and we talk about the longest walk, we realize that a lot of our resources have been lost, or sometimes we don't have a really strong database of these things. So collecting our oral history and working with the San Francisco Public Library, working with SF Heritage, working with the California Historic Preservation System, working with, a bunch of different folks to make sure that that's really saved and elevated. And I'd honestly recommend that for every single community, because we need to really decolonize how we're collecting culture and history and information and who we're hearing it from. Because like I said, the folks, when we talked about Ramontish Ohlone, called them extinct, they called them dead. And I'm not sure if that was Kroger. There's a few folks that came and said that are really important historically. And so to really give back that lens to the community through oral storytelling is important.
Thank you, Shreya, for clarifying on that. And you mentioned a few different ways that you collected that history in partnership with different organizations. So please do keep that in mind, everyone. There are, different organizations who can provide technology and resources to collect that type of history. And we hope that you all do that in your work moving forward if you're not already doing so. ECR, can you tell us a little bit more about Planner? I know that's a resource that you all utilize for your project.
Yeah, so we created this app for the community plan. And so because we did it in a 2-section way, we had first community meetings where elders could go up as they want, as is their tradition, tell their stories as long-winded or whatever as they wanted to. Tell a story about what it used to be like in Chinatown, why it's so important to preserve what they had, the resources that they used to have. I mean, they all told amazing stories. We had translators there, Spanish and English, or and Cantonese or Mandarin. We had the equipment borrowed because the city has to let us borrow it when we have a meeting like that. But then how do we turn that into data, right? Because it's anecdotal until it's numbers. And so it was important to take those same seniors out and en masse to walk around. And so to connect those oral history to actual, what I would like to see on this corner is this. So our Plan R app it's called Plan R, AR, augmented reality. We would walk around with them and it was so easy to use. It was great that they would say, here used to be a park, a little park a makeshift park we made, or seating, or like a 24-hour donut shop, things that were important to them as gathering places or as resources. And so it was a great way to connect how to create an oral anecdotal stories to actual numbers. And they could tell their stories the way they're used to. They don't have to type it out. But then when it came down to actually telling us what they need and why they need it, that was in the app. So then we could print out papers. And I thought that was a great, we tried really hard to connect our, sometimes you just have nowhere to go with a great story. And I thought that was an awesome, like a piece of information that the city, at the very least, we presented them. And there was no way out of that for the city. The city can't say, well, you got a bunch of whoever. No, this is real. This is residents. So I really thought that they couldn't argue, they couldn't fight with us on that. That's kind of like, like I said, that's a tool that we created, and we'd be probably happy to share with anyone that needed it, because it's not, it's something that I think everyone kind of every community can do for themselves, but we'd be happy to share that with anyone who needed it.
And I know that there's a video that you have showing how that app is used. If you want to drop that link in the chat, and people can also check that out and learn more about it, and kind of visually see what you're talking about as well. Thank you, ECR. Carrie or Rosalind, would you like to share any tools or resources that have been helpful in your partnership with ECR and Sharia?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I mean, I'm always going to go back to the people and the organizations that we worked with. I think the human resources for us were the most, important, because like ECR shared, I mean, they have information that you can't find in publications, you can't find on city websites. And so, I really think that Chinatown in LA has, just a wonderful network of organizations that have been, that are invested in the community and have been for generations. And so, they are our greatest resource, I think.
And I would agree with Rosalind. I mean, it's important to emphasize the people aspect as a resource. And just in terms of investment, I would say, getting board investment is very important. And to help with that, I mean, it's just providing opportunities for FaceTime, like, for example, like we just invited Sharia and Greg Castro to present at our board meeting, so they could meet our board members and kind of talk about their cultural preservation work, introduce why it's important. And just kind of small steps like that are, I think, important in just getting FaceTime and just getting allowing people to get to know each other, and especially now, which is harder because during the pandemic and everything's virtual. So it's kind of also taking that extra step. And I noticed also my colleague Woody in the chat, he just mentioned that kind of rather than focusing on lack of resources, that at SF Heritage, we're really just ruthlessly prioritizing. And that's kind of what I mentioned in my presentation, but we just have to prioritize this work, like especially cultural preservation work, because I think the Conservancy will find this too, that, we were founded as an architectural preservation organization. And kind of when people say, oh, you do historic preservation, people might think of one thing. They might think of saving buildings, for example. And with that, like Sherry mentioned, comes like a certain definition of integrity and like what is significant. And so I think it's important, these partnerships are so important because it's getting this work out there, making it visible in terms of communicating to our supporters that historic preservation is also cultural preservation. And it is kind of equally important as it's this preservation work and architectural preservation work, they're both preserving the character of our city, preserving what's special in San Francisco. And they're, both equally important towards that. So, yeah, for resources, I would say just continue to prioritize it, make it visible in your work, in your programs, on your communication channels, and so that people can start to understand like that this is historic preservation work as well.
Thank you all. Before we dive right into our audience Q&A, I want to share one last bit of information with you all to stay in touch with each of us today. We have our emails, our social handles, our websites. Please do connect with us to learn more about this important work and community partnership and deep listening and prioritizing diverse voices. We are very passionate about this work and invested in this work, and we thank you all for joining us today. So please do make note of this information if you'd like to connect with us after we end. Now we have a few moments. I want to open it up to the audience if there are any additional questions that you all might have for us today. We have a few moments to, kind of address any questions. I don't see any as of now, but we'll give a moment as we're waiting for the questions to come in. I invite all of the presenters, if you can, in a sentence or a few words, if you can just distill a key takeaway that you have for everyone today in this work in prioritizing diverse voices, what would you like to share?
I could go first. I would just say that a key takeaway for me is that community partnerships are long-term and they require engagement and investment over time. And so that means kind of prioritizing this work whenever possible. And that's what I would say.
I think for me, it's our elders are really the key, to our children and to our futures. So what we do today or what we don't do today with them is going to have a major impact on our children tomorrow. Thank you.
ACR, you want to go? I'll go. I think a key takeaway for our collaboration is really prioritizing the Chinatown residents and stakeholders, really kind of bringing them to meetings, connecting them with decision makers, really sharing our resources with them so that our collaboration could be stronger.
Yeah, I think if some of us are activists, we really have to do the middle work that creates that makes it so that things are digestible for people. And I think that's hard work, because sometimes, I look at a paper, I'm not a planning person by trade or whatever the issue is. I don't like developers. I don't like new development, but I have to sit there and like study it so I can be ready to answer these questions. And so for me, it's really important to do that hard work that bridges that for people and feel confident enough for them. So I have to sit down with stuff that I don't want to do. And that's important. If if I want to be present in the community, I have to do work first.
We do have a question that has come in for you all. How do you engage the divergent communities before their historic assets are threatened? So oftentimes we might understand a need after a challenge has been faced. And so for you all, can you share how you might engage before an issue might come up?
I'd say for us, it's just, oh, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, you have to take the first step in reaching out and building that relationship. So, I mean, each issue or case, community, or, it's going to be really different based on those, circumstances in the moment, but you just have to, you just have to reach out. That's the first step, I think.
Yeah, I'd want to echo that. Even just reaching out via email, being whatever, you'd be amazed how many people on LinkedIn are like, hey, by the way, there's this really crazy thing happening. And I'm like, you wouldn't think that like someone would reach out and be like, there's this development that's gonna, I think that's definitely the first step. Reach out, let people know what the problem is. And I know it's so hard where to even go, where to even begin. That's why I think if you have those good intentions and you're at this type of conference, it really opens up those spaces and those direct emails to be able to say, okay, because my job with the cultural district is to be a liaison to the larger community. So whether you're reaching out something in regards to health, cultural resources, plants, something cultural based, it's kind of like at least reach out to those folks in that community, because I'm sure anyone on this call can tell you, where it is that you should be going.
Right?
Yeah, and I would say just, sorry, I would say just creating the opportunity for people to give you kind of feedback about what's important, which, for example, like as of Heritage, we've created a pilot program called Heritage in the Neighborhoods, where we're creating this opportunity where we're spotlighting specific neighborhoods in San Francisco and kind of spotlighting their special cultural and historic resources, but also inviting community members, whether or not they, live in that neighborhood or they're just interested in preservation in that neighborhood, to come forward and help us, think of like kind of a preservation project that they would like to tackle in that specific neighborhood. So that's just an example of creating that opportunity, whether it's just like a forum or like a pilot program like this, for people to give feedback. Yeah.
Very important to think about creating those spaces for people to come together, right? It's not only about the building or the space that you're working to protect, but how are we continuously engaging with community members and starting with the conversation, as Rosalind and Shreya have mentioned, saying hello. Sometimes it all starts with the hello, or that ping on LinkedIn or social media. Are there any other curiosities that the attendees have for our wonderful presenters today? Any other questions as we wrap up? Feel free to add those in the Q&A, or if you're comfortable adding those in the chat. All right. Well, I want to thank each of our presenters once again. Thank you, ECR, Rosalind, Shreya, and Carrie, for telling us more of how we can prioritize diverse voices. And we hope that you all stay connected with us. We put our emails in the chat. Feel free to email us. if we were not able to get those while we quickly put that slide up. We also will be sending out some information that might be available to you all through the CPF app or the CPF forum for this conference. We hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you once again for joining us, and continue on with this great work. And we hope that you all learn something new and will take this into your work and working better with community partners. Thank you all.
Thank you.